Alright, so as we've done every year, this is like the one theme that kind of stays consistent for the whole time we've been doing this. And that is doing the horror movies throughout the month of October, or in this particular case, the very end of September and all the way through. And this time I wanted to start with what is probably my favorite kind of horror style, which is the anthology movie, which you'll notice was really popular with movies like Crypt, and it obviously goes back a long way, but we have stuff like what I really wanted to do with Trick or Treat in this video was Tales from the Hood, which is amazing, but it is so incredibly hard to obtain a copy of, and I haven't seen it in like maybe 5 years, so but I'm really hoping to get to that at some point, or at the very least obtain a copy of it. But it's one of those ones where you go on Amazon and it's all like $40 to $100 for just a single DVD, and hopefully we get there at some point. But there's also stuff like when they made Tales from the Dark Side into a movie, which was kind of underwhelming. Then there's, the Stephen King movie Cat's Eye or Asylum. And then there was a made-for-TV one that was actually pretty good called Body Bags. And then I think Raimi had a bit of a hand in that. And stuff like Campfire Tales, and obviously it goes, like I said, it goes all the way back to like the Vincent Price, Peter Lorre days with Tales of Terror, or Japan's Quaiden, even from the 60s, I think. And they've kind of been trying to resurrect the horror anthology movie lately with stuff like, I really liked the first VHS movie, but then the sequels obviously just took it in all the wrong paths. I like the concept, but I really do not care for the ABCs of Death movies. Both of them are pretty much absolute shit. And like Holidays from last year or so, and it's the resurrection of it is really not going very well. But nevertheless, 10 years ago, actually, I didn't think about that, Trick or Treat went straight to video, straight to DVD at this point. And obviously, because it was a straight to DVD horror movie, it was something that I didn't really pay any mind to. And then it ended up being one of those movies where pretty much every time you're at a friend's house, you just see it. Nobody talks about it, but you just see it laying around. And you're like, well, enough people have this that I'm a little curious about it. And then, but I still didn't quite get around to it. And then it started to gain more and more of a following. Until finally I was like, for a long time I didn't know it was an anthology movie. So that, as soon as I knew that was when I finally sought it out. And yeah, this is totally something that is a significantly higher quality than you would expect, hearing that it's a straight-to-DVD horror movie. I'm actually kind of surprised it even got that kind of release, given the quality that we have, and the almost instant classic status that it reached, despite how long it took me to go find it. Though, obviously, when you think about the anthology setup, you tend to think usually it's 4 or 5 stories, and usually there's like a wraparound. Sometimes the wraparound is related, like in Vault of Horror's case, or not. Like, it's really just this is just the world that the stories exist in, like the Crypt bookend with the kid. This, I don't know, I almost kind of struggle to call this anthology. It's less feels like an anthology movie and more feels like the Crash, Magnolia shortcuts of horror movies, where we have all the characters that aren't really broken up into their own specific stories, but just kind of, like, that are seen consecutively, but just kind of twist around, and everybody kind of runs into everybody at one point or another. And obviously there's hints to that all around, not just when we actually see their stories, but then there's just little things in there, like, I think there's a moment when Anna Paquin's just kind of sitting, kind of thinking about before she goes to where she's going to lose her virginity, and you see, like, right in the foreground, Leslie Bibb's robot costume walk by. And then there's stuff like the guy in the hot dog costume that the kids see when they're looking through the door at the party, and then later you see that hot dog costume laying there during the werewolf massacre. So I do actually like the way they handle it that way, and it's split up enough to where, you know, I don't mind the term anthology being used for it, but I do think it's just a little different than you would expect when you think of the traditional setup, which is usually the way I like it. But Trick or Treat does so well what it does that I think it works, and I'm totally fine with seeing it as part of the horror anthology lineup, especially since it's probably the best one we've had for at least the last 10 years. And obviously there's a lot of, this movie has a lot of foreshadowing in it, particularly the moment when we're seeing the newscast for the parade, and the woman's talking about all the different costumes and stuff like that, and she says, there's werewolves, zombies, and demons, you know, all around, wherever you look, and it's like, you think back and you're like, yeah, we are going to run into every single one of those at one point or another in the next hour and 20 minutes. That's also amazing how short it is, but manages to put all this effort and quality into it and the details. But to start with, we'll actually start with the Dylan Baker character, the principal, Stephen Wilkins, who the great thing that Dylan Baker does, and he's an incredible actor, and you've seen him in so many things. But the weird thing about it is when you look at this character, and you also look at Happiness, you realize that Dylan Baker is a master at playing people who are an extreme danger to children, but in a kind of darkly comedic fashion. Because this one's obviously much more intentionally funny than, say, what his character was doing in Happiness, but it's like he finds himself in these plights where he has to do these terrible, horrible things to children. And just, there's always, the way he plays it and the way his characters just happen to be written, it's like these just happen to be almost comedic situations. And this one, obviously, like I said, this one maybe not to the, it's weird. He's not murdering them in Happiness, but I'd almost say Happiness is more of an extreme, I guess because of the way it's portrayed. But, here when his first run-in is with Brett Kelly, the kid you obviously recognize from Bad Santa. And just right out there, just right out in the open, he feeds this kid poisonous candy and kills him. And then we have to do there's obviously the whole switch around to where we learn not just who this character is, but who his child is as well. And through this weirdly, darkly funny situation where he has to dispose of these bodies in his backyard, and it's so plain and out in the open that Brian Cox just casually says, "What are you hiding bodies?" Of course he is. But the thing that's interesting about this character is, I know when movies have this much of a following and have like a lore behind them, much like the Sam character mainly, but so I'm not quite sure if Wilkins has like a whole backstory or not. Like, I haven't delved that far into the research of it, so when or maybe there isn't, and it's actually the way I see it, which is, there's so much mystery surrounding who this guy is and why he is the way that he is, and I like that the movie really doesn't go into that at all. And it's not even, I mean, we learn that he kills children and has them buried in his backyard and carves their heads up in his basement with his kid. But it's like, it's not till long into the movie, like 2/3 into the movie, we realize the dude's also a serial killer, not just of children. He just goes around and does that as well, posing as a vampire type. And it's like, is this just at Halloween? Is it all the time? And it's like, surely he had a wife at some point, and it's like, did he kill her? Or did she die in a tragic way, and this is what made him what he is? And then you think about the fact that he kills children, but he's also a school principal, and it's like, is the fact that he's a principal why he kills children? Did he become a principal because he can go where children are and seek out who he wants to kill easier? So many questions around this guy. This very seemingly simple character. Just a high school principal in a suit. Not even a suit, like a dress shirt. And that seems to be all there is to it. And the children just assume he's wearing a costume when he's just wearing his normal clothes, just drenched in blood. Despite the fact that this still scares them. And I love the way he plays up the kind of mysteriousness of this character, but also it's weird there's such a mystery around him when the character is so incredibly straightforward about what he does. And obviously Baker plays that perfectly, and I love the way he's kind of written, at least in the movie, to where we don't really know this stuff. And then going into the next story, which to me is probably the creepiest one, which is the rock quarry, with the whole backstory to where it's this... Obviously it's like a campfire story, but ultimately with the way this movie's set up, we know something about it is probably true. In fact, probably all of it. And the way they show this... the whole aesthetic of this flashback scene, where it kind of looks like a horror movie from the 70s, and we're just kind of seeing a small portion of it. And like I said, there's so many different details that he puts into this that makes it all one creepy product that you can kind of look at and wonder what exactly the tipping point is. Is it because there's a whole bunch of disturbed children whose faces we never see? Is it the supposed innocence of the Halloween mask that actually makes them creepier in the long run? Is it the fact that these children have to be chained down? Or, like we were saying, is it just the way they kind of give it this look of almost like a 70s aesthetic, the way it's shot, this whole flashback? And obviously this is all leading up to what seems to be an obvious outcome, but the first time we see it, our minds are always wondering if that's exactly where they're going to go. And obviously they do the whole... It is a bit of a cliche where you tell... It's very like Are You Afraid of the Dark, where there is the campfire story, then there is the fake-out scare where the thing supposedly comes back, then lo and behold, the thing actually comes back. It is a very ancient setup, but at the same time, the whole movie is about Halloween tradition. That's what Sam is trying to keep in line here. So it's like, it feels absolutely fitting if the movie has a very traditional layout. And not necessarily in a cliche way, because it takes the traditional setups, and kind of, it still does its own thing, but still feels very familiar, but in the same way, is still effective because it feels like its own thing within the story. And when they rise, and we just hear... This is what we were talking about with It recently, where it's like, the horrible dismemberment of children is something movies don't typically delve into. Usually it's either talked about as something long in the past, or it's something that's very vaguely suggested. And while it is suggested in this movie because we only hear the sound effects, hearing the screaming and the sound effects is more than enough to say that it's in there, and it's not just kind of danced around or something that feels like it's very far away. Just that whole setup, and the fact that we don't really see what it is the zombie kids do. We just know that it's very graphic, and like I said, dismemberment is probably involved. But we never see exactly what happens to the kids down there, nor what happens to... We see Brian Cox in, like, the animated images right before it cuts to credits, but even that's kind of vague as regards to what exactly is happening to him and how they're doing it. They're still the size of children. And it's, and like I said, that whole kind of... The way they come out, and just the fact that just their appearance alone is very... I think the thing that does it for me is the fucking bunny ears kid. Whenever Brian Cox opens the door and they're all standing there, it's always the damn bunny ears kid that kind of really creeps me out. The way they kind of have that disgusting, muddy, long since dead look about them, not just their bodies but their costumes in general. And like I said, the fact that their faces are shrouded behind these seemingly innocent masks, it's a very, to me, it's the creepiest aspect of the movie, for sure. Then we go into the whole werewolf angle with Anna Paquin and her, where she's going, to where we assume it's to a party to get laid with her friends. But then again, it becomes quite like this story in particular is really heavy on the foreshadowing, much more than the rest of the movie is. Even the woman that blatantly tells us everything we're going to see at the very beginning. Starting with the fact that, number one, she's dressed like Little Red Riding Hood. And then there's the whole, when she doesn't want to come out of the dressing room and her friend is taunting her by saying, if you don't open the door, we'll huff and we'll puff. And yes, it's all, it all becomes very obvious very quickly. But there's still something to that build up to it, and the way it kind of ties in and brings in Wilkins into this as well, that still makes it feel like a really big reveal. And the effects, the werewolf effects are really cool and well done too. But the thing you'll notice probably the most about this big scene is the use of Sweet Dreams, the version that I believe originated from the House on Haunted Hill remake. And at first it kind of totally stands out, because while there is music in the background of the movie, there's the band at the parade and all that, and I think there's a couple of songs in there way in the background, but Sweet Dreams is the only song on the soundtrack that gets its own scene and is right in the foreground, and it kind of really sticks out in the movie. This movie that's kind of had a very traditional storytelling way up to this point, and then suddenly it's like a Marilyn Manson music video as the werewolves come out. But weirdly enough, it does still work, and it works enough that even though it's been used so many times, and later in Gamer, and obviously it originates from, I'm pretty sure he did that cover specifically for the House on Haunted Hill remake. I'll be honest, despite how out of place it is, every time I hear that song, the first thing I think of is this werewolf scene. Every time now. So, regardless of how out of place it is, it still totally accomplished something with that scene and made it very memorable in tone. So, that brings us to the final story where we come, because we've seen Sam walking around through the whole movie with his mysterious, gross bag that apparently has a cat in it, at least. And then we finally come to the point to where his story will come to a head with Brian Cox's character, which was teased earlier when Wilkins ignored him while he was being attacked. Where everything comes full circle, up to and including the reveal of who Brian Cox actually is. Which is not, like I say, the werewolf stuff was pretty obvious and stuff like that. There's a lot of foreshadowing and stuff like that. Yeah, the whole bus driver angle is just something that didn't occur to me the first time, and it actually legitimately caught me by surprise when everything was brought together in that one moment when he's burning the pictures. And so, you watch this Sam scene, and then it becomes this, and it's almost like an action scene, really, when they're attacking each other, and it's, obviously it becomes apparent. I do like the idea that they don't kind of flat out say in the movie what Sam's purpose is, but you can pretty easily put the pieces together yourself, and the way that the reason that Brian Cox's life is spared for all of 30 seconds. And the reason he does what he does, especially when we see Brian Cox just kind of watching, and it's every single thing on TV on Halloween is a Halloween special, and he's just trying to find one thing that's not Halloween related. And just his obvious complete disgust for the holiday, which probably stems back to the incident. So that should have been a clue, but yeah, like I said, I was surprised by it. And so I do like the way this scene is done. There's one really well done thing in particular that this does that I really love, and that's the little kind of technical fake out when Sam is not has disappeared somewhere, and he's kind of slowly, cautiously looking around the room for him, and then he's like walking by the bed, and the camera is down here and zooms in on his leg, and we assume that that's a point of view shot from Sam lunging at him, and it's not. we're just zooming in on his leg, and Sam is underneath the bed. I thought that was a really cool kind of fake out moment when you think you're seeing something from a particular standpoint, and it's coming from the other direction. That was really clever. And then there's... I've always kind of wondered, obviously research told me differently, but when I first saw it, I kind of wondered about... I kind of like the whole... kind of like how the creepy thing about the zombie kids from the bus is that we never see their faces. They're always obscured by their Halloween masks. So I wasn't quite sure if they were going to show Sam's face or not the first time I saw the movie, and of course they do. And the thing, because obviously most of the promotional stuff and all that are like, you know, the plushes that are around and all that other stuff, or people in costume. It's almost like until you see the movie, you never realize that we're going to see his face. And when we did, well, I did think it was a cool design. My first question was, I wonder if he knew when he made this that Sam was going to be kind of a horror icon afterwards. If he knew he was going to be making an actual horror icon that would go down with the other movie monsters, if he would have shown his face or not. But research told me that Sam's face under the mask was like one of the very first things in the conceptual process of making him, so I'm going to assume, yeah, that probably was the full idea. And it does work, and we do have the kids to offset this to where it's like, well, maybe it would have been scarier if he kept the mask on, but we have that for the kids on the bus. With Sam, it's okay, and it does kind of give us more in regards to, you know, we realize it's not just some kid with supernatural powers, that is an actual damn demon. And yes, it is ultimately a very cool design, because this is the point in the movie typically when you'd get really underwhelmed because you feel like they show too much. But showing Sam's face ended up not being total suicide like it would have been in another movie, so that obviously had to have been a relief. So, yeah, it's, like I said, it's definitely in line with the anthology movies, even though it's done significantly differently in regards to how they intertwine and not just being their own individual stories. But obviously it's a shame it took me so long to see this too, but because I probably would have been much more... I've already seen it like maybe 6 times, and I only discovered it like 3 years ago. It would have been nice to have spent this whole last decade with it, but this last 3 years has also been like, it's like a new Halloween tradition when you discover this movie. And yeah, it is one of the absolute essential Halloween movies now. Like, it may... I'm not quite sure if it goes to Carpenter's Halloween straight to this, but this is pretty damn close behind in regards to... Not as, obviously, you know, Carpenter's movie can't be reached, but I mean as far as making it a tradition in Halloween to view certain movies, this is definitely right there. So yes, very, very well done for a movie that went straight to DVD. That's still quite baffling, but now we go on to Vault of Horror. Obviously, about 3 or so years ago, I did a video with Tales from the Crypt and Creep Show using this exact same DVD. And obviously, Tales from the Crypt is the... I don't want to already jump and say the good one, but it's the one that really stands out and has the really memorable stories in it. And then the very next year, they went on that path and continued taking stories from the magazines and made another movie the following year. And the thing you'll notice, though, about this particular edition is that you kind of get the shit into the stick when you have this DVD, because apparently there is, I think it's on Blu-ray now, and I think that might be the R-rated version, but for the most part, like with this theatrical edition and then the one in this DVD, the PG version. This movie was supposed to be a lot gorier. And watching it, you can really tell. Like, before I researched this, which would have been the first time I saw the movie, there are moments in this DVD that will be very jarring because it looks like something really big is about to happen or something really gory is about to happen. And it just makes it look like it's really shoddily made. Because it's like you see, like when she brings the hammer down on his head, or when the vampires attack him in the restaurant, you don't see a moment when these things happen. It is so obviously a still photograph of the moment, spliced into the movie, right in the middle of the scene. And it, like, totally breaks it, and it's, like, really underwhelming after so much build-up. And, like I said, it just makes it look really cheap and like they were kind of trying to dance around gore and all that. But no. Then I learned later that the gore is in there, just not this version. And they had to cut the scenes down by just doing that. Like, it feels like there had to have been a more effective way to cover that, but whatever. At least do reshoots or something. There is, like, that mysterious still floating around when it's the 5 major characters, and they're, like, walking away from the place, and they're like, their faces are like skulls, and they have like this dead way about them, and it's like, that's apparently not a scene. That's not a scene in the movie. It's apparently not a deleted scene. Some people think it might be a publicity still, but just it's almost kind of like its own creepy mythology. That's like that picture is floating around and nobody knows exactly where it comes from. And then of course I was talking about they take stories from the magazines, like the first one. And stuff that you would see later in the series that Zemeckis brought forth to kind of try and reinvigorate this, which obviously worked immensely. Even spawned movies like Bordello of Blood and Demon Knight. Not the best and not really in line with the show at all, but still. There is the second one. The second story in the movie is the one about tidiness. Apparently is the only one that's not from the actual magazine. It's from another thing. I knew that before I started this, and now I don't remember the name of it. So, going into each individual stories, like I said, sometimes I do prefer when it's like an unrelated wraparound before and after this series of 5 stories that don't connect at all. But you'll notice with Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror, they do the thing to where all 5 people come together and they're each telling an individual story. So it still technically ties together as a whole, even though we're doing individual stories consecutively. And obviously here, I like I said, I do prefer when they're all separate, but it's fine. It's fine. I'd say the first probably did. It's kind of a problem with Vault of Horror coming right after Tales from the Crypt and how effective it was, and it's like it does just kind of feel like the leftovers, the stuff that wasn't quite interesting enough to make it in Tales from the Crypt, we'll just put in Vault of Horror, even though they had so many stories to go off of. These are the ones that end up here, and that's not to completely bash Vault of Horror and say that it's completely not well done and they picked all the boring shit, but to go one at a time, starting with the story where we have the real-life siblings, Daniel and Anna Massey, who are Raymond Massey's kids. Daniel, you might remember from when he played Noel Coward in Star with Julie Andrews. And it's one of those, it's basically like the first story in Tales from the Crypt, the whole Santa thing, to where it's like, it starts with a murder, and you think it's going to be totally something that obviously it ends up going into something totally different. But it starts off as just like this dude who's looking for somebody in particular, and he hires somebody, and once he gets the information he wants, he kills the dude. And it's like, okay, I wonder what kind of horror this is going to bring out. It's definitely, somebody that's not afraid to murder people. It's like, how do we get, the really outlandish Tales from the Crypt-like stuff? So it continues, he finds his sister, he kills her, and then he goes to a restaurant, and then you're just kind of, okay, here's the thing, this is actually more of a compliment than anything, it's not some stereotype or something, but it's like, Vault of Horror is a British movie, so naturally when you see this, you think, it's going to, when you know that it's British, you know it's going to be more downplayed than you may be used to in American horror movies or other. Um, so you just kind of spend it feeling for a build up, and it's obviously kind of there because we do see there is something always happening. The dude is like on his little spree here, but then he gets to this restaurant, and it does kind of set a bit of a dark tone when the guy just says, "Oh well, you know, we're closed. You need to get out because we close before the sun goes down because they come out after dark." And it's like you kind of get a sense of where this is going, but at the same time, the problem is that it basically feels from out of nowhere. To where it's really, we don't really get from one, and maybe that's the point, is the just sudden turn, but it's like, there doesn't really seem to be much of a progression here. It's just like, it's one thing, and then just out of nowhere it's another, and then that's it. Like, that's the payoff. And it does feel very underwhelming, and like I said, as soon as it said, well, they come out after dark, it's like, we pretty much know where it's going. It could be a number of things besides vampires, but vampires was probably the first thing that popped into your head, and sure enough, that's all that it leads to. Like I said, maybe the cut-down version of when they attack him makes it more enticing and makes it a bigger payoff, but it's like, it just kind of seems, it's just as soon as we feel like it's going somewhere, it's over. And while I do understand that setup because we got such a short runtime and we got like 5 stories to tell here, I do understand if these might feel like in another movie it might be like we're just starting when we're actually ending, but I don't know, here it doesn't quite have the same effect as it does in like the story in Tales from the Crypt, when the dude comes back. And it's like, we pretty much know what the outcome is, because we see the way, we know he's been in a car wreck and we see the way people react to him. And it's like, okay, he's probably a zombie. And then when he looks in the mirror and sees that he's a zombie, that's it. That's all there is. But the way that story is told from the point of view perspective, and the way they build it up, and the way they really amp up the suspense of when he's going to find out what he looks like, that's what makes the really short stories with the seemingly abrupt endings really work, is the way we build up to them like that. And a lot of the stories in Vault of Horror, much like this first one, really don't have that. And then we have, like, and the same thing with the second story, is there is so much build up and we kind of get the idea of where it's going. This one has a significantly bigger payoff with the whole, everything is neat and organized up to and including after she's completely taken him apart. But there is just so much uninteresting build-up to that. And it's like, we kind of know where it's going, and it's like, you kind of have an initial, oh, when you see just how far they take it. But even so, and it also kind of brings back memories of, like I said, I'm not quite sure what stories from the magazines were used for the show. I'm obviously going to assume a lot, but and weirdly enough, this one's one of the ones that, the only one in the movie that doesn't come from those magazines, but it still has the feel of well, I guess technically the episode has the feel of this, but it'll bring back memories of, if you saw the show, the Collection Completed episode, where it feels like that. So if you saw the show first, it might be a bit underwhelming when it reaches to this, but it doesn't have near the same kind of build-up because it's got to be in a hurry, this movie, and that kind of really, I don't know if like the production was rushed because they so quickly wanted to put a sequel to Tales from the Crypt out, but needless to say, it kind of suffers from at least feeling like that, if that's not the actual intention. So then going into the next story, once again, they add more supernatural aspects to it, so it kind of feels like we're starting to progress somewhere. So it's basically the build-up of how is this guy going to... This guy who's obviously very greedy because all he cares about is his show and drawing a crowd to it. And doing things that seem absolutely impossible. And then he discovers this woman who can make a rope float out of a vase. And is strong enough to hold her as she climbs it, despite the fact that there's nothing suspending it. And it's like, how is this guy gonna find a comeuppance by using a rope in a way he shouldn't be. I wonder how this ends. And there is the scene with his companion where she goes up into the ceiling and then we just see the blood. It's kind of like I imagine Wes Craven being inspired by that when he did the Johnny Depp scene, only this one is much more, like I said, downplayed, where we just see it forming in the ceiling. That's effective, but then obviously we get to the point to where our obvious outcome is coming. This is not helped by the fact that we were talking about the stills and the gore, and we were like, so I understand now that that stuff is in there, it was just cut, but still, there are still things in this movie that make it feel incredibly cheap. Take, for instance, the little string you can see pulling the rope every time. It's like it kind of takes away from the thread a little bit. Though if you're into that, it might give it a charming, cheesy nature for some people. Then we have the fourth story. Once again, feels very similar to something we saw on the show. Like I said, don't know if that comes from the magazine or not, but that is the episode, Dig That Caddy's Real Gone, which was the second episode, I think, when Joe Pantoliano was the bum that they gave the cat lives, and it starts and ends with him buried alive. You can kind of see the inspiration for that episode here. And once again, very simple. A guy happens to have the Romeo and Juliet potion that can make him seem dead for this whole scam thing. And then things just happen to tie together and things don't go as planned, and he still ends up dead anyway, because irony. Like I said. For the record, as I've been trying to express, Vault of Horror is not as bad or boring as I might be making it sound right now. It's just that, like I said, it is very downplayed, but all the stories do feel like they're going to a very obvious conclusion, and like I said, it just kind of feels like it's very rushed after the success of Tales from the Crypt and the quality of it. And you have stuff that feels like it would be effective if we didn't have the knowledge that we do. Like the moment when he's obviously taken it and he's going to appear dead. Like he's going to technically be dead, just not entirely. So when she walks in and we zoom in on his body and she screams, it feels like some kind of technique you would use to show us something we weren't expecting. But we're totally expecting him to look dead. So I'm not quite sure where the tension or the, big effect is supposed to come in here. And then, like I said, they do kind of do the irony thing, but it all feels blatantly obvious. Now, with all that said, my favorite story in this, probably by far, is the last one. With the voodoo paintings that basically are used to, whatever he does to the painting, or whatever he puts in the painting, happens to the person that happens to be a portrait of. And he uses this to get revenge on the people that rejected his paintings, one of which is Denholm Elliott, who we just talked about from the Indiana Jones movies. And among many other things, like A Room with a View, but... and the thing here is, one reason it's probably my favorite is it has something that the other stories are lacking, and that's time. We actually get time to know this guy and watch how he's kind of been lived in. And then we see his journey from his passion to his rejection and how we can feel that. And it feels very potent and actually real. And then it feels earned when he starts to take his revenge out, and the way he slowly starts to realize what these pictures are capable of. And then it all leads up, and everything feels effective when it happens, because we had that time, and we had that tension that could build, and the fact that we know where all these characters are coming from. The other guys might seem like, just surface level evil and... unlikable and all that. But the fact that we can feel from our protagonist and where he's coming from is what really makes this story so effective, and ultimately rather tragic, despite the questionable decisions he made throughout the story. His death still feels quite horrific and quite, saying tragic, more or less. Because we've watched him go from where he was to being cut down by these guys, and just when he's able to give them a taste of their own medicine, much more so, but still, give them a comeuppance of sorts. That we've seen him come this far and ultimately have that fall, if you will. It all works and it all comes together and it feels like a complete story and it doesn't feel like we're just getting blue-balled, really. So that does make it rise a lot and is much more effective. So here, and then and that scene when Denholm Elliott has to kill himself, when he turns the gun on himself, that long zoom in on the gun is really, really intense. Much more intense than anything we saw in the other stories. So they really could have just cut out everything else and made this feature length, and I think it probably could have worked at the same runtime, the short runtime. Talking about the wraparound story, I do kind of, like, you do kind of question, because that's, like, one of the major things you think of here, the idea to take the Vault Keeper out of this. I do, like, because we had Ralph Richardson in the first movie, but then here it's like, I do like that they're all just in the room and they all kind of have to figure it out for themselves. I think kind of gives a more impactful finish to the movie when it just kind of starts to piece together for them, and then they just kind of, like they're in a trance, just kind of lifelessly walk out into the cemetery. And that's, I do think that works better than having another person there to kind of explain what's happening and why they're here, and a person they can incessantly ask questions to. So, yeah, obviously there's a lot of attempts at, like, irony and stuff like that, but still, it's just a movie to where everything, it basically is just a tiny little bit of build-up to somebody being unceremoniously killed, no matter how much of a supernatural fashion it's in. And there is ways where you can say, you know, like, there's nothing particularly poetic about the justice, even though that's so clearly the point. And like the first one you could say, like, oh, is it because he's figuratively bloodthirsty that he's killed by vampires? And it's like, you more so have to reach for it than for it to feel like it's there and apparent and have the effect that it's supposed to. So, but it's really not bad. There are some effective moments here and there, even in the stories that aren't so great. But I do think the last story really works and is kind of about the right amount of time to devote to a story like this. But the thing is it's not just all about build-up. Like, there's always a progression in character or otherwise in that last story, and that's what the others are really missing. And like I said, even if they don't have, like, you can very easily, like I was talking about with the zombie in the second story of the first movie, it's like you can do things really small with just a hint of payoff and then end it there, and it can be really, really effective. But like I said, it feels like by this point they'd used up all their gas in Tales from the Crypt, and they didn't really have much else to put in Vault of Horror except that last story. So at least that's the last story, and it leaves us on a high. But up until then, there are some things here and there, but for the most part, a lot to be desired. So definitely not my go-to for anthology movies. It's pretty much best watched with this DVD, to where you can just watch it right after Tales from the Crypt, even though that kind of brings out its faults even more. But yeah, it's fine. It's not totally unwatchable. You can, you know, like I said, they're so short, you can just make it a tradition to watch it and Tales from the Crypt back to back, and it kind of feels like a whole product, just one half significantly more interesting and fun than the other. So, like I said, maybe that's just the downplayed aspect, but it doesn't really work for me in the way most movies like this do, particularly in that era where it was really kind of thriving. So yeah, that's what we have here. Obviously, I don't think I need to say which one I prefer, but the now Halloween classic, or Tales from the Crypt's not so interesting brother. It's very clear. But yeah, this is definitely something I hugely recommend, is seeking out all these horror anthology movies, because it kind of feels like I was saying, that campfire style way of telling, where it's like you kind of get a lot for the price of one, and you always have those different payoffs from the different stories, and it feels like you kind of get more bang for the buck, even if the stories are very condensed, because you have to fit in so many in such a short amount of time. And yeah, definitely find Tales from the Hood if you can too, because that's, yeah, and it kind of feels like it takes a different approach to the creativity in that movie is outstanding, but definitely, obviously probably don't need to tell you to seek out Trick or Treat, I'm sure. I was like one of the very last people to come across it, so, yeah, so once again, you're going to be getting 2 of these a week now. You'll be getting another one on Sunday, and then we'll do that through October, so, with the reviews in between, the new movies, so, yeah, hopefully this was a good enough start, and because we still got a lot to go, so in the meantime,